Hi guys, it's me George. So I am doing a video today which is the differences between Wicca and traditional witchcraft. So the reason I'm redoing this video is because I actually had a look at my original video that I had done about 8 years ago, and to be honest, I was pretty fucking mortified. It was not factually correct, and one of the most disturbing things for me, well, disturbing, it's not like that severe, but in terms of misinformation, was that the video actually got like quite a lot of views. And I think actually it was kind of unfair at some point and fairly biased. Sorry, I'm just living my best Scottish life. But I think the video itself was actually quite biased. So I wanted to redo this video. I wanted to redo this video to talk about the differences between traditional witchcraft and Wicca. And I think one of the things that happens is that a lot of the time within the witchcraft community, we have people that won't, you do sometimes find there are some people that won't accept when they're wrong. And I think that's actually quite wrong to do in of itself. I think it's quite a humbling thing to be open and honest. I keep my older videos up because I love to actually see how much I've changed within my personal practice. And that's the reason why I'm not going to necessarily take it down. But hopefully this video actually reaches more views. Touch wood. So I'm going to talk about the differences. So first of all, the kind of where these both kind of come from. So Wicca was a modern neo-pagan witchcraft religion that was created in the 1950s by a man called Gerald Gardner. And he actually kind of fused a lot of different traditions together. There is Masonic influences there from the first, second and third degrees of Wicca. There is so many different kind of aspects, particularly the Greater Key of Solomon, the Seals of Solomon. That whole system of magic is very, very influenced, as it influenced Wicca quite a lot as a practice. However, one of the things I will say is a lot of Wiccans won't actually necessarily say that it's a religion. It's not uncommon for some Wiccans to say that Wicca is not a religion. I've actually heard that quite a few times. And then also I've heard Wiccans that say it is a religion. Witchcraft, traditional witchcraft is more of a practice, it's more of a spiritual practice, but one of the things that tend to happen was you kind of had this split, this divide, right? So they're actually closely related to each other, and actually if it wasn't for Wicca, traditional witchcraft also wouldn't have as much recognition as it has today, and that's one of the really important things to say. So you had Gerald Gardner, and you also had a man that's quite undervalued in my personal opinion, known as Cecil Williamson. And they both had very different ideas as to what witchcraft was. Gerald Gardner's vision of witchcraft was very ceremonial, whereas Cecil Williamson was, his view of witchcraft was very folkloric. It was all to do with the wayside witch, the idea of the village witch, this idea of folk magic in witchcraft. And one of the things that actually happened was they fell out, and literally at one point I think one of them actually lunged a sword at one another. It's in the Cecil Williamson's book of witchcraft. It's pretty like, whoa. But they really did fall out. They did not get on, and Cecil Williamson went on to kind of open up the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boscastle, despite having a lot of issues trying to move his museums around. But Gerald Gardner had the Witch's Mill in the Isle of Wight. And yeah, so basically there's two very different characters. On the other side of it, you also had a man known as Roy Bowers, also known as Robert Cochrane, who created the Clan of Tubal Cain tradition of traditional witchcraft. And he was actually a Gardnerian Wiccan first, but he had actually created this system of witchcraft that he had said had gone back, yay far, long and long, back to 1734, all that kind of thing. But the actual sources and kind of knowing that, whether or not that's true, has kind of been debunked quite a lot. There's also Dorian Valiente actually debunked quite a lot of things that Robert Cochrane said. Robert Cochrane was actually quite fantastical in the way that he, some of his ideas, some of his kind of beliefs about certain things. But Robert Cochrane detested Wicca. He hated Wicca, and actually used to call it the Old Lady Brigade. By the way, the sort of things that I say do not reflect my own opinions. Let me make that perfectly clear. And this is the certain people's thoughts and ideas of it. Cecil Williamson also did not like Wicca. He disliked Wicca. There was also a belief there that Gardner had kind of created Wicca as a way to kind of incorporate bondage in it, to incorporate kind of sexual elements there, and it was kind of him being perverted. Again, that's not my personal opinion, that's the opinions of a lot of kind of traditional craft people at that particular time. So Wicca is based off a big melting pot of different beliefs. It takes from Margaret Murray's God of the Witches. It takes from Charles Godfrey Leyland, Aradia, Gospel of the Witches. And there was a lot of romanticism in that time when it came to things that were actually factual and things that actually weren't factual. However, on the flip side, Robert Cochrane was highly influenced by Robert Graves' The White Goddess, which again, a very similar thing. Is kind of not necessarily fully a reliable source of referencing and information, an accurate source of information. So both these kind of paths were kind of, they're kind of criticism towards each other, but actually there is kind of both controversy on both sides. Wicca will typically incorporate the use of the worship of the god or the goddess, so the male god and the female goddess. It's a dualistic religion, it's a dualistic belief, where they believe in a divine feminine, a divine masculine. In terms of gods, in traditional witchcraft, yes, there are sometimes gods and goddesses that are incorporated into traditional witchcraft. For instance, the clan of Tubal Cain, they used to do that, but traditional witchcraft is a very large umbrella term, because you have to remember there are so many different branches of traditional witchcraft. Much the same way there is actually different branches of Wicca. However, for the sake of argument, when I reference Wicca, I'm only referencing Gardnerian and Alexandrian, as in traditional initiatory Wicca, as in mystery tradition Wicca. So in terms of gods, when it comes to traditional witchcraft, there is sometimes goddesses and gods worked within traditional witchcraft. It's not normally a case of worship, it's normally a case of working with them. But actually, in terms of the god and goddess in Wicca, the closest figureheads I can find in terms of traditional craft is the folkloric devil. If anyone's unsure about this, please have a look at my video that was very Kylie Minogue at the time, Better the Devil You Know, where I go more into depth about him and what he's all about. Also there is kind of seeing him as the sort of a trickster kind of thing, like a trickster spirit, the folkloric devil, very different from the Christian Satan. However, modern traditional witchcraft does have aspects of luciferianism within it, and the idea of seeing Lucifer as the Lord of Light, the light bringer, a person of freedom, of liberty. So there is Luciferian aspects to traditional witchcraft. Doesn't make it satanic, just means there's aspects of Luciferian gnosis within there. The closest thing we could have to a goddess is some traditional witches will talk about Dame Fate or Old Fate or Cruel Fate, but it's morely just a case of that being fate. It's not necessarily someone you go to work with, unless I'm mistaken. I haven't known anyone in traditional witchcraft to work with actual fate. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe but I've never heard it. For practicing traditional witchcraft for a while, it's not a thing I've heard of. If I'm wrong and someone's like, oh, I do, that's okay, that's cool. The closest thing we kind of have would be the Queen of Alphamay, who has a lot of references to Scottish witch trials, particular very famous witch Isabel Godey and her elaborate and very intricate confession, one of the most intricate confessions in witch trial history. Very, very detailed, have a look on that. But yeah, so we do kind of work with the Queen of Alphamay as the Queen of Fairy. In terms of rituals, Wicca will do something known as casting a circle, meaning they are delineating a sacred space of the ground around them. In traditional witchcraft, we don't really cast a circle. It's not normally a thing that happens. Normally what happens is you will lay a compass round or a compass. So the idea of the compass is we believe the spirits are kind of there with us, but they're already there. We just need to go to them. And that's literally all you're doing. You're going to the spirits, whereas a circle is normally about either conjuring things up, making the place sacred. Traditional witchcraft believe the place is sacred enough. In terms of gods, traditional witchcraft is normally more spirit-based and normally more spirit-led than Wicca. Wicca does work with spirits. There was a familiar spirit that an Alexander's coven had called Michael, known as Michael. There's a very good documentary that you should check out on YouTube. Off the top of my head, I'm sorry, it's gone. But there is a lot more aspect of working with the familiar spirit within traditional witchcraft, working with ancestors, working with plant spirits, with spirit allies. And traditional witchcraft will take a lot from folklore, whereas Wicca has kind of a melting pot of different things about it. So there's some of the differences. The actual rituals themselves, normally Wiccan covens will take place indoors. Not always true, but most of the time they tend to be more indoors, whereas traditional witchcraft tends to be more outdoors. Again, not every ritual we do in traditional craft is outdoors. Sometimes do indoor rites, but typically you tend to find that. There's actually a really cool video of Alexander's basically working in a place called Lineage in Druid Circle, where I used to frequently work when I lived in Manchester, and I had that absolute privilege and pleasure of working in such a beautiful place with beautiful, amazing human beings. And we had some incredible experiences there, but I believe it's King of the Witches by Alexander's, you'll see it at the beginning, that they're in Audley Edge when they call in a guy called Michael to an initiation. And they're like, Michael! And he's like climbing over rocks and falling over nettles and butt naked. So yeah, Michael has balls. Wow. Wrong reference, wrong time. But you know what I mean. So speaking of balls, typically Wiccan covens will actually work what's known as Skyclad, or in the buff, naked. Whereas traditional witchcraft doesn't normally tend to work naked. Yes, some people do in traditional witchcraft, but normally it's kind of a case of robed covens or just clothed. Which is probably why one's indoors Morley and one's outdoors, Morley. But yeah, in terms of the tools of traditional witchcraft, the tools of traditional witchcraft primarily is the stang, a forked staff, forked at the end, which basically can either have antlers on it, or it can be a forked staff, a representation of Old Horny or the devil, the folkloric devil. Again, very different from the Christian Satan. But he's normally, we normally work with that also as world tree, as Yggdrasil. Basically, it's a pole. It acts as an axis mundi, a world tree, a medium in which the spirits can come up and down. And it's not an uncommon thing in spiritistic traditions for that to happen. In the religion of voodoo, they also have a pole through the temple that acts almost as a medium for which the spirits can travel up and down. There's other spiritistic traditions as well where this happens, so it's not actually an uncommon thing. So yeah, Wicca will have the athame, the knife that you don't cut with. It's used to direct energy, to cast a circle. The chalice represent the goddess, where you drink wine from. The pentacle, which is a wooden, clay or stone disc with certain inscriptions on it. And that can be used to charge talismans, to charge tools, that kind of thing. Whereas with traditional witchcraft, the stang, a knife is just not, can be used for cutting as well, can use it for both. Normally it's just used for cutting things. And they'll also make use of tools such as bull roarers, sweepers, witches' sweepers, things that have some historical ties to them, to witchcraft. A lot of traditional witchcraft takes from folklore, and it takes from things like the Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. It will take from different aspects. Is traditional witchcraft a red thread, unbroken line and lineage? No, because it's so far back from what it's taken from, and because of witch persecutions, because of also the 1800s where there was a lot of romanticism, you do kind of, it's kind of hard. It's actually more reconstructionist, you know, and I don't really necessarily like using that word, but it does have older ties to it. Of course, that's not to discredit that, but traditional witchcraft as a practice takes from older sources, so pre-1950s sources, basically, of folk magic, particularly around the UK, Britain. Traditional witchcraft tends to be very regional. So where you are working, where you live, for instance, I live in Scotland, so I would look into the history and the aspects and the folklore of Scotland and Scottish witchcraft. It tends to be very regional and very regional based. Also very based largely around the spirit of the land, or the genus loci, connecting with the spirit of that land, which is why I am drinking Iron Brew. A jest, but yeah. So those are some of the differences between Wicca and witchcraft. And I hope this has helped. Oh, another thing before I go, in terms of ethics and morals, Wicca, there is a misconception that Wiccans go by the law, do what thou will, and it harm none. So basically, do whatever you want, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. And people see that as the rule in Wicca, and actually not factually correct. A reed actually means a piece of advice. A reed isn't a rule, a reed isn't a law, a reed is a piece of advice, and actually it has been known for Wiccan covens to cast curses on people. I actually believe that Alexander's coven done it as well. So it's not an uncommon thing for that, you know, for that to happen. The Wiccan reed wasn't actually a rule made or created by Gerald Gardner himself. It was actually from a poem. It was from a piece of poetry. So its basis of actually having a place in the religion or the belief of Wicca is kind of here and there. Whereas traditional witchcraft, we have the idea of personal responsibility. So basically, if you curse someone, you need to be prepared to deal with seeing that and to live with what you have done. So you take personal responsibility for your own actions. And I love that. It's always something that really resonates to me within my practice, not even just my practice, it's something that actually resonates with me in my life. So yeah, there are so many different differences. That's hilarious. There's so many differences that I could talk about in regards to Wicca and traditional witchcraft. But I wanted to redo this video because, as I said, there was a lot of things in the video that wasn't actually factually correct and actually quite biased. There tends to be this kind of head-on-head kind of, you know, clash against traditional craft and Wicca, like, ugh, you know, but in actual fact, the beauty of both of these is that they kind of made each other. So without each other, I don't think they would both be where they are now in terms of practices, in terms of noticeability, in terms of awareness, and actually influence. They've both influenced each other in different ways. So I think that when I hear traditional witches bashing Wiccans or Wiccans bashing traditional witches, it's just a little bit like, stop it now, it's getting silly. We're basically sisters, cousins, like, just leave it out, because they've both had influence with each other. I actually realised a lot of videos I originally had posted on my channel were actually quite anti-Wiccan, and for that I actually do apologise, but I think it's really important to own your fucking shit. And I have friends who are Wiccans who I love dearly, and Wicca is a belief. It's not necessarily my flavour, it's not my practice, but I have a lot of respect for it. I have a lot of respect for it as a practice. I have a lot of respect for it as a traditional witch. I don't see Wicca as fluffy bunny. Traditional Wicca isn't fluffy bunny. It's another aspect of it as well. I'm sorry, rambling now. I could talk a lot about this, but Wicca is a mystery tradition, so meaning that you need to get initiated in order to become a witch. The reason that changed is because Doreen Valiente was actually asked, do you have to become initiated to be a witch? And she actually said, no, actually, I don't think you do. She didn't create Wicca, but she's also considered the mother of modern witchcraft, which is also funny because she not only was involved in Wicca, she was involved in the clan of Tubal Cain. Doreen Valiente was kind of cool. She was like that halfway point. She kind of, you know, yeah. So that's one of the things, whereas traditional witchcraft, yes, there are covens or coveens involved, but it isn't necessarily an initiatory mystery tradition, because there are old rituals such as the Orkney Witch's Charm, where you basically self-dedicate yourself. You lay between 7 stones and you sing or say the invocation and then throw it into the sea and say, take me with each throw. That's not in Scots because I'm going to murder it. So yeah, there's also the aspect of putting one hand on the head, one hand at the bottom of the foot, and basically kind of working with that. And that is another way to dedicate yourself to the devil, to the folkloric devil. Because there's a lot of things in folklore about witch initiation, right? So traditional witchcraft will utilize that, might change it up, but will utilize that and gain inspiration from that. So I hope this helps. Yeah, you'll tend to find as well, like traditional witchcraft is very folky. There's a lot of focus on herbs, on wart cunning, which is known as herbs, roots, powders, kind of the focus on folk magic. There are aspects of traditional witchcraft that are very Gnostic though, that do have gnosis, such as Clan of Tubal Cain, 1734, and the ancient Celtic Church, which actually stemmed off from the Clan of Tubal Cain. Also, Andrew Chumley's Sabbatic Craft, which in the 80s was formed in the 80s. Sabbatic Craft, which again is very Gnostic. So there are aspects of those of traditional witchcraft that can be very Gnostic, but there's also aspects of traditional witchcraft that can be very, very rustic. I am very, very rustic. Gnosis and, you know, Gnosticism is something that can play a part in my practice, but doesn't really play that much a part in my practice and isn't necessarily that important for me as an individual. So that's just the way I see it. It's just the way it feels for me, which is very different from other people. So yeah, I hope this video helps, and I kind of hope I've done Wicca justice and traditional witchcraft justice. I'm not going to take the old video down, so if you want to go and have a look at it and have a laugh, crack on, live your best life. But over and out, and peace.